Hi everybody. Today we're going to be talking about species in a very brief little video just talking about the definition of a species. So prior to modern biology, species were mainly organized based on their physical characteristics. Similar species had similar appearing organisms were said to be in the same species. Organisms that were less similar in appearance were said to not be in the same species, or weren't even given given designations that sounded the same. But today we use a more evolutionary biology-inspired approach to this categorization. And what this means is that we will define a species as those organisms that can produce a fertile offspring. So that's this part here. So this fertile offspring, that's where we really start to talk about the modern take on species. We also consider, from Ernst Mayr, a famous biologist of the 60s, um, the idea that they should be genetically similar. So that means that they're going to have similar sections of DNA, as well as occupy a niche in nature that is similar. Members of different species cannot interbreed to produce fertile offspring. That's because their DNA is too dissimilar. So a good example of that is that we discussed in class is the horse and the donkey. Although horses and donkeys share many physical characteristics, they will, when they are crossed, they have infertile mules as their offspring. Now, the infertile mule is infertile primarily because of DNA differences. There's a difference in the number of chromosomes that horse and donkey have. So they have different numbers of chromosomes. These are the information carrying unit of the cell. That different number of chromosomes means that when they cross, they produce offspring that have differing that have an unequal number of chromosomes, and they can't produce offspring, uh, at least not regularly. Members of the same species may or may not look alike under our new definitions. So they may not look alike. So this is the case, for example, in dogs. So all dogs belong to the subspecies Canis lupus familiaris, and we should watch out that this lupus should be included in there. Previously, they would have been categorized possibly even as Canis familiaris, but now that we know that uh, they're very much related to wolves, and in fact a subspecies of wolves, they are listed this way, Canis lupus familiaris. You'll see this naming on the next page. Now, all dogs can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Uh, not There are some cases where the babies, although would be fertile, might not be able to be carried to term. So that's, the case of a Great Dane baby inside of a mother who was a Chihuahua. There's a possibility that the babies themselves might become too large and that it could cause complications. But that's not to say that those babies would not be fertile, would not be able to make their own children uh, if they could be brought to term. So that's the real trick there. Now, I've used the word subspecies, so we should talk about subspecies as a non-interbreeding. Non-interbreeding. Now, we're using the word non because we want to indicate that they could, but they choose not to. They're non-interbreeding populations. So this is groups. Another way to think about this is groups of organisms that exist within a species. They are placed in the subspecies category. They typically do not breed due to geographical differences or due to some sort of sexual preference. So that might be some sort of appearance-based preference, like change in different localizations around the world. Different subspecies of the same bird might have slightly different colors of feathers. And then if the male or female decides their mate based on the color of feather, then mixing those species from two different parts of the world would not produce offspring because they would not mate. They wouldn't even recognize them essentially. We could also think about um, physical characteristics as well. So let's look at, or some other uh, even geographical on a very small scale, for example. So let's look at the example of deer mice. So there are several species of subspecies of deer mice uh, that are present in North America. One prefers the open grasslands, and the other ones prefer the forest. So this means if we start to picture this, this world, we have this grassland, and then we have our trees and our forests over here, right? So here's our forest, and maybe there's a couple of conifers in there. So in that forest, we have one mouse, and in the grasslands we have another, right? So let's just put, here's our little mouse here. And then over here we have a mouse that lives up in the tree. So these two mice, although they are from the same species, because they're from different subspecies and because of the way that these species sort of function, right? This mouse is going to hang around in the open area, running back and forth, back and forth, and it's not likely is going to interact with this mouse who has to spend all of its day in the woods, sort of, hiding from hawks and owls and things and digging holes and it's got a very busy day ahead of itself, running through the woods. The other one has a very busy day of its a day running through the grasslands. It doesn't have time to make little cross-country visits to, what the equivalent is for a mouse, to go visit the woods to find a mate. Instead, it focuses on the areas that it knows where there's food and the areas that it already has some experience in. And this stops them from interbreeding. And then over time, they become slightly different. And those slight differences enhance that effect. So these open grassland mice, they just, they're now having children who understand the open grasslands. They don't understand the forest, so they stay out of the forest. They have, the forest mice understand the comfort of the forest and the cover of the forest, but they don't understand being out in the open. So they just never, those two groupings, kind of thinking about their sort of roaming ranges, right? These roaming ranges never really cross. And so because the two areas that they're found in don't cross, we don't have any crossbreeding, even though as subspecies they probably could produce offspring. And maybe in like a controlled environment like a laboratory, you could get them to crossbreed. So and if you had a third species, right? So let's make like a bigger one that has like, you know, a really big nose and big feet or something. So this one's a big burly rat, and maybe it's able to. This one has its own ring, and maybe it tries to. It spends time in both the forest and the grasslands. Maybe it has like a migration aspect to it. Well, that one would cross over with both of them, and then we might find in the wild some crossbreeding. But they will generally be sort of stuck. In this case, we have a species of mice that that are going to stick to what they know. And by sticking to what they know, they might not interact. Is an example also in giraffes where there are 9 different types of giraffe, subspecies of giraffe, but they are subspecies mostly because of the spaces across Africa that they are found. So throughout the entire continent, there are different locations where giraffe are found, and those giraffe don't roam that far. Maybe partially because of humans, right? Humans have chopped up the continent into sort of zones, and there might be zones where the giraffe can no longer migrate through. And so that divides the giraffe up, and now over these, past millennia, those giraffe have sort of subspecies. They never interact with the other ones. If you take two giraffe from two different areas of Africa, you might even have trouble getting them to mate. The brown bear and the polar bear is another example. So let's look at this little picture here. I know that you don't have this yourself, but you can look it up online if you'd like, or you can sketch it out for yourself. But this is a phylogenetic tree. It looks at how similar the genetics are between different bears, and it also plots that out in terms of how long it would have taken for those differences uh, to become permanent. So if we look way back, we can see that something that was at one time called a panda, the lesser panda or the red panda, we have these in the zoo. They're quite cute. The red panda is actually closest genetic species is a raccoon. So prior to this type of nomenclature, we did label the species as a panda, but upon study of their genetics, we find that it's actually only tangentially related to the giant panda, and in fact is closer related to the raccoon. And I think even now they're starting to put it off on its own sort of side branch as completely different from some of these other bears in a lot of different ways. Even and then if we look over here at the brown bear, the brown and polar bears are actually considered the same species, with the polar bear being a subset of that species. So I drew the little picture down below, but essentially we have the this is all brown bears, and then some group of brown bears over time sort of isolated themselves into the north, and they became lighter in color over the last, probably a million years or so. And what do we got here? We got about 2.5 million years or so. So over the last 2.5 million years, those brown bears that have been living up north have become lighter and lighter in fur color, and they have become what's known as a polar bear. But now with climate change and the polar bears having to travel more southerly to find food, all of a sudden the geographical barrier has been broken down, and or they are overcoming that geographical barrier. And now we are starting to see these brown bear polar bear hybrids out in places like Churchill because the bears are now crossing their geographical barriers. So thinking about Canada, I'm trying to draw this is our bay. This is the uh, this is the bay, and here's Manitoba, right? So at the very top of Manitoba, this is where we would normally find polar bears, sort of anywhere north of here. This is our polar bears. And then our brown bears, I believe, are they range sort of over here in this area. And so the brown bears typically kind of go this way or maybe through, we definitely have them in Ontario. So we have brown bears that range throughout Manitoba and into the Canadian Shield. And then we have the polar bear, which typically sticks around the edge of the bay and then mostly into the north. So actually not much into Quebec at all, Quebec and Ontario. So if anything, if there are any bears, it's probably brown bears out there. But with climate change, this has changed. These barriers are starting to change, and the bears are starting to roam. So let's put a little red line here. So this is climate change, post climate change range. And so now these bears are starting to cross into the brown bear region, and now we're going to have those species are interacting with each other. As those species interact, we of course are going to get a crossing, and we might even see the polar bear subspecies, could eventually disappear theoretically as they get reintegrated into the brown bears. So that's kind of why we want to think about them as subspecies, because they could reintegrate if their roaming zone changes in such a way. Probably not likely, but maybe the rise of a second subspecies from the polar bear brown bear cross. Now, I did not mention the word niche, if you or niche or niche. So a niche of an organism is the functional role that it plays within an ecosystem. Sometimes that's easier to understand if you think about some of the examples we talk about in sometimes in grade school even, of like a predator. A predator has a certain niche or a niche. It hunts and it consumes. But when we talk about niches in evolutionary biology or ecology, we really want to get into all those details. So like, who is it hunting? Who is it eating? What are we, all those details. So all the little factors, so all the biological factors. What foods does it eat? What organisms does it need? What type of weather is it successful in? All those factors play a role in describing its niche. So a polar bear, for example, is a very specific niche. It has a niche. It has a niche where it hunts seal. It travels on ice, so it requires that abiotic factor. That's non-living. So that's non-living factors, living living factors, and then we have the biotic factors, living factors. So for a polar bears, they eat seal. They hunt on ice. On ice, they do well, and they have fur adapted for the. They have fur for winter, fur for snow, camouflage, flags, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those factors, if we could define every single little factor that defines that polar bear, that is its niche. And the more similar two organisms have to the same niche, then the more competition between those organisms for resources and for existence. So now human beings, we have a very unique niche. We make a lot of our own food. We can control a lot of our own environment. So that's why we don't have a lot of competition except for other humans. Meanwhile, something like a mice in Manitoba are going to be in the same niche as squirrels and as chipmunks, and all of those three organisms are going to be fighting. They have slightly different niches, maybe more time spent in trees, less time spent in trees. Sizes of mice is smaller than squirrels, but squirrels might be stronger or less predators, etc. So those are all part of your niche. And an ecological niche is determined by those factors uh, and the biotic and abiotic factors of the environment that the organism interacts with. Okay. And so closer niches typically imply closer species. So here's another example that we talked about in class. If you'd like to get into this one again, you can look at what we talked about in class. But here we have Canis lupus. So Canis lupus familiaris, the domesticated dog. Canis lupus lupus, the gray wolf. They're subspecies because they do not typically get bred with each other. So human beings have spent a lot of effort and energy into domesticating the dog and breeding it as a separate species, but truly it's only a separate subspecies because if there's ever a chance for a wolf, or if a wolf ever takes interest uh, in a uh, in a household dog, it could create a subspecies, create a hybrid, a crossing, and that crossing would be successful, and it can be even carried through. Similarly, we have the Canis lupus dingo, which we find only in Australia. And we also have things like coyotes, which look similar, but in the case of coyotes, they cannot be crossed. So coyote, a Canis latrans, likely will not have a successful cross between the coyote and the gray wolf. So we don't have any hybrid wolf coyotes out there. And it could be many factors, but one of those factors for sure is maybe not an interest in cross in breeding, but they could also have some other genetic factors that will actually cause the offspring to not come to term. So maybe changes in the number of genes, changes in the number of chromosomes, all those sorts of things have factors here. We also have cats. There's been a lot of effort now in trying to bring wildcat traits into the domesticated cat. So if you'd like to investigate that, I would recommend you check out in the classroom video. We did a little bit of a search for that, but you can find some hybrid cats. Uh, they are apparently very naughty cats. You don't want to. The Bengal cat is an example. It's a domesticated cat breed that was created by domesticated cats from hybrids of domestic cats with the leopard cat. And a leopard cat is a type of wild cat. And there are other cats like that. All right. So you can let's see if we can pull this up here. So here's some examples of a wild cat. So this is a hybrid cat where they've taken some wild cat traits and they brought them in. And so you can see some other wild cats. They look like cats, but they have very distinct sort of characteristics. They typically, because they are crossed with wild cats, it gives them a bit more character. They can be very aggressive or territorial and less easy to train because they are now using genetics that were not domesticated. Uh, so those traits were not taken out of them. So in this section, we talked about the word species, we defined it, we used it in the science of biology, and we talked about a little bit about the historical dependence and how we now use this word to talk about inheritance from an inheritance evolution perspective. All right, thank you for your attention and have yourself a nice day.